Welcome to June. I've got something a wee bit different for you. This in the background, this expressive, colourful, loose painting of a flower meadow has been on my mind for a wee while, and I knew I wanted to look at Gustav Klimt's landscape work and look at how he abstracts the composition, simplifies shape, so you're not drawing things in a representational way. You're not drawing them necessarily as they look, but you're drawing them for the power of their shape and their colour and how they pull a composition together. So this month's project you might want to break down into two stages. First stage, I do a copy of Klimt in my sketchbook, and I use gouache for this, and it's the gouache, the Himi gouache, which is really quite opaque. Lots of colours, so very easy to fill a sketchbook page. I think this took me half an hour. And as you can see, lots of expressive brush marks, lots of variety in scale. So you've got thin marks, fat marks, round, long, angular, and it's that variety that makes this an interesting painting to look at, both from afar but also up close when you figure out what's going on with the detail. That in itself could be enough of a project for you this month. But if you want to take it from your sketchbook to a bigger piece, I talk you through how I paint over a painting I don't like. I painted it a couple of years ago, and I can tell I maybe finished it halfway through and I didn't resolve the issues that I was having. And a couple of years on, I've probably learnt a few more skills, and I've got an idea of how to manipulate what I want to see on the canvas as well. And to be fair, that cow on the canvas just wasn't cutting the mustard for me. She was looking a bit too sassy, a bit too angry, so she had to go. And what I love about when you paint over a painting is that it gives you history of swooshes of thick paintbrush marks, colours that might sneak through from the background, and that history kind of informs your new painting, and you couldn't have got to your new painting without that history being there first of all. So don't ever throw your unresolved canvases away, just paint over them. Leave it a little while so you can practice a few technical skills, and then go back to them and paint over them with a fresh idea. And that lovely history and that mark making really makes it quite rich. It adds to the depth, and it gives you some nice happy surprises as well. The trouble with going from a sketchbook to a canvas, there's a few things I want to mention here. Number one, Klimt had a portrait format for his painting, and this gives a lovely tension for the subject that he's painting. It's got a pull going upwards, which suits the meadows and the flowers reaching upwards. So it logically makes sense in terms of what it's visually trying to communicate with you. And just to make it difficult, the painting that I was painting over was on a square format, and a square format can be considered more contemporary, but it can also lose the dynamism of a portrait piece because it hasn't got that tension, because it's equal on all sides. So it lends itself to something that's a wee bit calmer, unless you play with the composition. And I do a talk over on the time lapse when I'm painting this, because I'm thinking it through as I'm painting. And I don't know if you're anything like me, but when I'm thinking and painting, it's hard to talk and explain what I'm doing. It would be a load of gobbledygook. I'm much better narrating over it when I've got a sense of the experience I've been through. And I can tell that I was looking at how I was going to manage that calm, square, quiet composition, and either bring a focal point or bring in a bit of a composition that would add depth and also interest. And you'll see in the time lapse that I decide to take the top third, push it back with some thin white, and that immediately gives us distance, and that slight angle coming into the canvas makes it a little bit more dynamic, so it sort of pulls and pushes with the square format that we've got. And then I get to the point in this particular painting where I've got some really nice shapes, I've got a nice format, but it needs something else. It needs a thinner line, a more delicate line, and I decided to take the risk of putting coloured pencil onto canvas, which I never normally do. You kind of think of coloured pencil with your sketchbooks, don't you? And I've really enjoyed mixed media recently, and as you know, I love sort of experimenting with what works and what doesn't work together and the surprises that it gives you. And I really love the softness and the fragility of those coloured pencil lines, and it gives a bit of chaos, but quiet chaos. So you've got this quiet, calm, equal-sided format. You've got a very soft suggestion of depth and a dynamic shape coming in on the composition, and then those soft lines that are crazily going everywhere add movement, add a sense of breadth, wind coming through those wildflower. And I was really chuffed that I took the risk in making that decision, having a go. And I think that's another thing about painting over a painting you don't like. It doesn't matter about the risks that you're taking, because already it's better than what was on there before. Now this for me could stand as a background for a cow to go on and become a commercial piece for me, or it could be something that I use just as in a painting itself. So I took it up to the house just to sort of see how it sits on a wall, and yeah, I think I'm just going to sit with it for a while and see what else comes from it. I don't necessarily want to pull a focal point on a particular flower, but it might be something that I now could take into my work on the iPad and work digitally, and it could inform an illustration that I'm doing. So this has got the potential to go a number of ways for me. I could either stick a cow character on there and it would sell as an original and as a print, and it would look really pretty, or it could inform an illustration piece. It could actually do both, but really you don't want to do that. You want to commit to one idea or another. So for the time being, I'm happy with how it is. I'm going to leave it as that, and when the opportunity comes for it to be one or the other, that's when I'll decide. So I thought you'd quite like to see that sort of insight in how I might work taking a sketchbook idea, making it bigger, but then also considering what's its next step, what's its life to be, where does it belong. And very often these things tell you. Opportunities either present themselves and you get a chance to use your work in lots of different ways. So it was a bit of a workout going from sketchbook to big painting, because I haven't done a big painting. This is 100 meters square, and I haven't done one this size in a little while, and especially not while I've had my pick line in my arm, and I feel like I've been to the gym. So it might be that if you take this whole entire project on, you do the sketchbook in one day, gather your materials, and then you would need a whole day for this, because you will pull and push and try to decide which way your flowers are pulling the composition. And it doesn't come from an immediate plan when you start out. It comes from a reiteration of your ideas as you're working through. So you're solving the problem with paint in your hand, rather than thinking, I'm actually just going to replicate this. Because what you've done is you've replicated a Gustav Klimt in your sketchbook, and you've learnt about his composition, his colourway, his shape management, and then you've taken that inspiration, you've put it onto a slightly different format. You've used slightly different materials. I was using acrylic and emulsion and coloured pencil, and you're using what you've learnt in your sketchbook but applying it a different way. And that's the way you should deal with any influence or any inspiration that comes your way. Actively study what works from the people that you admire, whether that's old masters or contemporary artists. But this is an active study, and this isn't something that you could actively sell or replicate as your own work, but you can take the knowledge and the experience of recreating that and then create something that is wholly, totally yours. If you get stuck, give me a shout. Once you get to this stage, it can be a bit frustrating. There's definitely a bottom of the U in pulling this together. So shout me if you get stuck and I'll try and give you a few pointers as you go. So you might want to post up some midway photos of your painting. And if you do get frustrated with it, just let it sit on the canvas for a few days. Let the paint sink into the layers and let your brain subconsciously solve the problems rather than push yourself through the frustration trying to fit it all into one day. Anyway, as usual, have fun and let me know how you get on. So I'm just getting the gouache paints ready, and very often I'll spray these with some water just to activate them. They stay quite wet and quite pliable for quite a long time, and all you need to do to sort of make sure that they're good and ready to use is give them a little squish with water, and it just soaks in and reactivates them. So I very often use the lid as a palette. You never have enough flat spaces to work, do you? You end up surrounding yourself with stuff that you might just need. So I'm surrounded here with pots and paint from another project that I'm working on, but I daren't move it in case I forget what I've been using. Anyway, I'm using the Pith sketchbook, and I've got a pre-prepared with emulsion page, and I've got these two different colours on the go here, and I'm just activating a little bit more of the dusky pink. The brighter pink you can see is some fluid acrylic that I've had. Very often when I squeeze too much paint out, I'll just begin spreading on another page just to sort of randomly start those abstract beginnings. And I very often find these are the best way to start paintings. They give you a bit of a mid-value to start your project with. And of course, some of the pinks and some of the greens are going to be useful for me on this particular project. I'm using a medium flathead brush, and I've got the sketchbook orientated to a portrait position, a portrait format. And I'm looking to sort of make a bit of a dark value first. If you see in the reference photo in the bottom of the screen, the base of the Gustav Klimt painting is relatively dark. You could have actually gone in there with a really, really sort of dark blue, or you could even have a black, and as you can see here, I'm adding a bit of black to the green that I'm smooshing on in that bottom corner. What this does is anchor your painting. It gives it a dark value, which gives it structure. Very often when we lose the structure in our paintings, we've lost the dark value, and an easy way to sort of check this is to take a photograph of your painting, turn your photograph into black and white. Ideally, turn it by turning the saturation down rather than putting a black and white filter over it. And by turning the saturation down, it immediately tells you if you've got dark values, mid values, light values, or a good mix of them all. And very often it's the dark values that we lose. So here I'm just getting in a really loose colour beginning. I'm working on top of prepped pages, and I'm scratching in the paint, keeping it nice and loose, and making sure that I'm working across the pages, not in any one area at all. And obviously I'm going nowhere near detail at this stage. You'll notice that some of the brush marks are the same, and we get like that. We get comfortable in our reach of using the brush stroke, and also application of paint as well. And here I'm just using a wet wipe to soften some of those lines, smudge some paint across the page in a different way, and I'm disrupting what I've put down there in a, even though it was random the way I was applying the paint, random with an idea that I've got a reference that I'm working towards, but random as in I'm layering up and seeing what happens. And by disrupting with a wet wipe, I increase that difference in brush stroke mark, and I disrupt any patterns that I've subconsciously been making as well. I'm dipping it into the lighter yellow green here. Now this particular gouache paint set is really opaque, so it's really easy to work one colour on top of another. Any paint that's got white in it is opaque, and all of these colours have white in them, so it's very easy to work layer upon layer upon layer. I'm playing with the scale of my brushes now, and I've dropped down to a smaller flat head, and I'm starting to get some of those circular shapes in that represent flowers. And you'll notice with Gustav Klimt that he's simplified all of those flower shapes, and what he's done is included scales. So you've got some big circles, small circles, circles on top of circles. So he's got difference in scale, but he's got a unity in terms of the type of shape that he's using. So there's a lovely sort of rhythm and pattern, but disrupted pattern to his work. And if you look at any of Gustav Klimt's work, you can definitely tell that he loves pattern. And so he's taken that love into, whether he's doing high society portraits or whether he's doing landscapes, you can see that that's his particular interest, and it's one of his style bricks that makes his work really recognisable. You'll notice I'm working across the page here, so sort of keep darting up and down and from left to right, right to left, and making sure I'm working across it rather than just in one particular zone. And that way you don't take one area too far and forget how you've done it. You treat the painting as a whole as you go. And I'm not being too particular about copying the reference. I'm using it as inspiration, and what I'm trying to do is understand how he's managing the composition and how he's managing the layering of colours. So a few tips for approaching this active study of Gustav Klimt. You've got a download in which you can print off the reference a little bit larger for yourself. But if you squint at the reference, either on screen or on your printout, and just notice the clusters of flowers that he's playing with, how he's sort of batching them together. So there's clusters of white, there's clusters of yellow, there's clusters of pink, smaller clusters of purple, and he's using those almost as blocks. So I know that if he had made the white flowers bigger, that would have really pounced forward. So to manage that, he's actually used white in a much smaller application, but lots of, and given space in between. And this helps sort of interrupt the white a little bit. And then the softer colour of pink, because that doesn't pounce forward as much as white does, he can afford to go slightly bigger with those shapes and also cluster them together. once you get to your greens, if you can vary your greens, so if you have a warm green and a cool green, so it might be that you have a yellow green for warm and a blue green for cool, and play around with how they interact with one another. And notice on the reference how he does little tiny dash marks, which kind of reference all the different grasses and stems of flowers. He doesn't draw them individually, but he does just put a repetition of thin line in, and he's layering up those different warm and cools so they play optically with one another. As we're getting these shapes in, we're kind of getting a sense of how the composition reads across the page, where the eye travels, and as it's not an exact copy, I'm kind of seeing if any ideas come to mind as to what I might do when I go onto the bigger canvas, and sort of thinking about how I can translate that in a bigger scale. It actually felt quite unnerving putting the red into this painting. It seemed a colour too far away from the green, the soft greens and the soft pinks and warm orange yellows that he'd been using. But it's almost acting like an accent, and it's almost giving you a dark value as well. So if you were to turn this particular painting, as it is at the moment, into black and white, the red would represent one of your dark values. The yellows and the yellow greens would be your lightest value, and then everything in between would be mid value. And what you're trying to do with this painting is retain the whole selection from mid to light and light back to dark. And very often if a painting isn't working, it's because there's a problem with your values somewhere. And that'll be unique to each one of us. We have almost like a subconscious preference. I tend to have a darker value preference, where a lot of my paintings will have a dark base, and the thing I will lose very often is the light in my paintings. And being aware of that makes it easier for me to spot mistakes and fix any paintings that are just not working out. Very often I'll be able to tie it back to the value management. So I'm working on a smaller brush here, and I'm getting in those clusters of white, and you can see that white is really powerful on top of everything that's gone before. And as we were saying earlier, that if we did really big flowers in white on this, it would shout too loud, it would jump forward too much. But that smaller dashing of white, it helps to give a rhythm, and it also helps to give breadth in what is quite a busy painting. So just thinking about Gustav Klimt's style and the way he approached his work, I've mentioned before that he's really into his pattern. That's definitely one of his stylistic techniques that makes his work recognisable. And his natural landscapes and backgrounds, he always stylized the flowers and trees, so very often you'll see organic forms, and sometimes it can look like beautiful tapestries. His flower fields and gardens are often vibrant and dense, and they give minimal perspective. So that might be a consideration if you're going to scale your work up into something bigger. Are you going for something decorative and kind of achieving a flat element to the work rather than a more dimensional element to the work? Sometimes we don't have to put every element, every trick in the book into a painting. Sometimes it's about what really works well for us. And in Klimt's perspective, pattern worked really well for him. And pattern in a painting gave him rhythm, it gave him beauty, and it was very decorative, so it became very, very popular in homes as a decorative piece of art rather than a representational piece of art. He's got lots of delicate flowing lines and outline forms, and that is what contributes to it feeling really lyrical and rhythmic, and it gives a real quality to the sense of his work as well. So I'm at the stage now where I've got clusters of colours in, and I'm now working on top of those original colours with smaller shapes using a smaller brush, and also slightly changing the colour as I layer on shapes. So it might be that I'm mixing a lighter pink to go on the pink, or it might be that I'm mixing a orange to go on top of the yellow, or vice versa, or a lilac to go on top of the purple. And what this does, it creates like a shimmering effect, so it dazzles the eyes because there's so many layers and differences in size of shape that it becomes something that you experience as much as something that you understand to be flowers or a meadow. He was particularly good at dazzling people with his patterns, and obviously with his gold work as well, that he really enjoyed to do. But he did an awful lot of landscape work in which his patterns and repetition of line or shape became something that he could really manipulate to his advantage. So really consider that as you're applying this to your sketchbook and thinking about your own design that you might take forward. And I'm going to put on some lovely music just as I start to bring in some really thin lines with a rigger brush. And again, I'm playing with scale here because I've got lots of round shapes. I now want a difference with a long, thin shape. And of course, this is representing the grasses as well. And it's that difference that gives a little illusion of abundance and contributes to all of those layers as well. So enjoy the rest of this time lapse, and I'll pop some music on, and I will pop back in once I get ready to scale up. So let's scale up now. I'm just preparing a bigger palette with some acrylic paint. I'm popping out some white, and I will get some red and yellow and green on the palette, and a touch of purple too. And I'll keep that as my main colours, and I might have to sneak in a wee bit of black at some point if I'm trying to pull my values a little bit darker at some stage. But these particular colours, they're kind of reminiscent of what's gone on with the active study of Gustav Klimt. I don't mind if I sort of take a different path to what I've been working on in the sketchbook. In fact, ideally, that would be the best way forward, because I'm then starting to interpret that work in, or certainly the application of that work into my own style and my own design, which is ideally what we all want anyway. So paint's going on, I've got a pot of water. Obviously, because this is a bigger canvas, it's 100 by 100 centimetres, I need to scale up my tools and materials. So I've got a lot more paint out, so it would be lovely to paint with the gouache, but it would take a ridiculous amount of paint on 100 by 100 square canvas. So that's why acrylic becomes super useful. And I've scaled up my brushes as well. So my brushes will be a decorator's brush, a medium flathead, and any sort of tool that can help me get those lovely round organic shapes that Gustav Klimt was using in his design. So I'm taking a step back regularly with this painting, because obviously when you're working so huge, when you're up close, you're only looking at like 10 centimetre squared part of the painting, and you need to walk across to the other side of the room to look at everything that you're applying on the canvas. I've been working across the canvas as quickly as possible without too much thought, without too much judgment, because physically and experientially I know what I want to achieve, because I've tried it out smaller in the sketchbook, so I'm well practiced in that sense. So I'm working through the variety of colours, and I'm starting to mix up different colours using what I've got on the palette, and I'm playing with different shades with darker values, which the purple comes in really handy for. And I am desaturating the colours if they're feeling too bright from coming out of the tube, desaturating them by using one of their opposites. So for example, if the green is too bright, I'll add a bit of red and make it a bit duller. It'll make it into an olivey green. I've also kept the theme of the grey emulsion, which I really love in the sketchbook, and I was wanting to experiment with it on the canvas. And this is kind of giving me a lovely tinted atmosphere to the painting. Now, from time to time you will get into a pattern, and I say this often, and so that's why it's really important to step back and see that pattern, or take a photograph of the work and look at it on the camera, and it's much easier to spot. I'm going back in with a slightly darker value here, and I'm painting some of the stems of the flowers in using the negative space. So rather than paint a stalk for the flower, I'm painting around that, the space around that stalk, and it reveals and leaves the colour underneath. It's a really lovely way of working, but it does confuddle your brain from time to time. And I don't want to use that trick everywhere, because it just becomes too much of a trick really, and it becomes, if you use something too much, it can become really gimmicky. But if you use it selectively, it can work really well and have more sort of power in using it in a little way. I'm getting tired at this point, that's why you can see the top of my head, and I'm sat down and I'm working my way around the canvas using my smaller brush just to get in those little dash marks that we've enjoyed using in the sketchbook. It's a bit harder to do that on a bigger painting, to sort of really get those smaller details in, and I really want to see if I can sort of get a gentler, smaller line in at some point. Now here you can see my radical move of getting rid of the top third of the painting by using a watery white, and what this is doing is introducing the element of distance and depth into the painting, something that Gustav Klimt maybe didn't really do in terms of atmospherically managing the layers of paint. But to look at the composition, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction to this video, I needed something to kind of play with the composition and make it a wee bit more dynamic, because the square format was very calm. And if you apply a lovely patterned design to a square format, it can just look a bit gift wrap or wallpaper. So I definitely wanted to sort of add a bit of tension and bring in a stronger composition. And so my way of doing that was to add a little bit of a horizon line and push back the depth of field. And you'll see, because it's quite watery, the water I'm using, the mix of water and white, some of the flowers that I've painted over actually show through in a very faint way, and that gives a lovely perspective of distance, and it pushes those flowers to the back of the painting. And conversely, the flowers at the front can now pop forward as something that's brighter and bigger and bolder. And I think just that little technique of pulling and pushing can really help describe in a really gentle way that it's got distance and it's got depth. So something you won't have seen easily in the time lapse is the application of the very thin line, and I've actually used coloured pencil here, pinks, greens, yellows, greys, and I've mixed it up with long, tall, thin grasses, and I cut across the flowers and into the sky, and what this has done is create a quiet sort of sense of movement and breath in the painting, and it's given another application of difference. So everything's got a lovely big organic shape, whereas the thin coloured line gives an area of detail that you don't really notice unless you get real close up. Anyway, have a go at this. It's a big one, this project, and please shout if you get stuck.